Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. So we talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Roast Jeffrey, and subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. Now, Trayce Jackson-Davis is the first major player in college basketball to announce that he's declaring for the draft, and he will not return to college basketball next season. What does it mean for Indiana? What is Trayce Jackson-Davis' legacy at Indiana? And is Trayce Jackson-Davis ready for the NBA? I'm going to answer all these questions and more, so let's get into it. Now, Trayce Jackson-Davis is one of the best players in Indiana basketball history. Right now, he's fourth all-time in program history in points at 2,100 points, and he's had a fantastic career at Indiana, and he's gotten better and better every single season. But he has announced that he's declaring for the NBA draft, and is that the right decision for Trayce Jackson-Davis? Now, I think that on paper, a lot of people would say that he should have went to the draft a long time ago because he was a fantastic player, even from his freshman year when he was at Indiana. But the one thing he did not have was a jump shot. He never shot threes. He never shot long twos. He was always a player that played in the post, and he played underneath the rim, and he's an undersized player at 6'9", so in the NBA, he can't really get away with being an undersized center like he does in college. So that's why a lot of NBA draft scouts did not have him as a top draft pick even after his freshman year, even though he put up 13.5 points per game. And I think that's a big reason why Trayce Jackson-Davis decided not to declare for the draft, because of the fact he loves the Indiana program, and he was only going to be a late second-round pick. And then in his sophomore year, he bumped up his points per game to 19 points, and he was playing much better basketball, but he was still predominantly a low-post player, and he got better at rebounding and a little bit better at passing, but he still really wasn't ready for the NBA draft, and he thought about going pro. He probably would have been a second-round pick, and Archie Miller got fired after that season because Indiana did not play very well. But then Mike Woodson came along to be the new head coach of Indiana, and obviously he was the head coach in the NBA for a long time, so Trayce Jackson-Davis decided to run it back again, and he played at Indiana for another season, and he averaged 19 points per game again, and he got much better at passing and blocking. He improved those numbers, and he still was dominant rebounding the ball. And he did declare for the draft after last season, but then he caught the virus when he was going to be participating in the NBA draft combine, and he said he thought it was a sign for him to come back to Indiana for one more year, and he did. And this year he's putting up monster numbers, averaging over 20 points per game. He's averaging over 10 rebounds per game for the first time in his career, and he's got much better at blocks and assists, averaging over 3 per game on both of those stats. And he's putting up numbers not seen in college basketball since Tim Duncan. And now Trayce Jackson-Davis has decided to declare for the draft this time, and he's not coming back to Indiana for his extra year that he could possibly use, but he's going to be graduating this year, so I can understand why he wouldn't want to come back for another year. Plus, he could get hurt next year and move down the draft list, and plus he's already 23 years old, so a lot of NBA draft scouts are not going to look at him the older that he gets. So I think that this is the right decision for Trayce Jackson-Davis to go to the NBA draft after this season, because he's putting up the best numbers of his career. He's improved in so many categories in like passing and blocking the ball. Even though he has not improved on shooting the ball this season, he has shown that he can do it in practice, and I think that a lot of NBA scouts are going to be willing to take a chance on him earlier in the second round this year than they would next year. So I think that this is a good decision for Trayce Jackson-Davis. It does sting for Indiana fans because he won't be there for the Hoosiers next season, but Trayce Jackson-Davis has to go to the NBA this season because this is the last chance for him to have a really good shot to get drafted because of his age and because he hasn't really started to shoot the basketball throughout his career in Indiana, so he needs to go to the NBA draft now. So it makes a lot of sense, and hopefully for Trayce Jackson-Davis, he can prove at the next level that he can shoot the basketball and he'll be able to have a successful NBA career. Now, what does Trayce Jackson-Davis declaring for the NBA draft mean for Indiana? Now, this is a really tough loss for Indiana because they're going to be losing one of the best players in program history, and you're going to have to be able to replace him, especially at the center position, where they're going to be really lacking next year because they're also going to be losing Race Thompson, so you're only going to have Malik Renew back, and you're going to have Logan Duncombe on the roster still, so Mike Woodson's going to have to get some transfer portal players to be able to help out Indiana for next season, especially because they're also going to be losing Xavier Johnson and Miller Kopp. So overall, Indiana's just going to have a roster overhaul, be able to bring in a lot of transfers, kind of like Illinois did, to be able to make their team still competitive in the Big Ten next season. And I think with Trayce Jackson-Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino, who could also declare for the draft in his own right, both of those players probably going to be able to be in the NBA next season. It's going to make Mike Woodson look good and the Indiana program because they got 2 players into the NBA. So I think that's going to help out Indiana in the future to potentially be able to still be a really good team even without Trayce Jackson-Davis, because more recruits are going to want to come to Indiana because of the fact that Indiana has a track record of getting players in the NBA under Mike Woodson. Now, with that being said, what is Trayce Jackson-Davis' legacy at Indiana? Trayce Jackson-Davis' legacy at Indiana cannot be understated because of the fact a lot of people are going to say Trayce Jackson-Davis is the guy that put up big numbers and he didn't do much else, because even though he could become the 3rd all-time leading scorer if he can pass Don Schlunt later on this season, and he's probably going to be the all-time leader in rebounds and the all-time leader in blocks at Indiana. A lot of Indiana fans are going to say, well, Trayce Jackson-Davis didn't win much, and that is true, because if you look at his record as a Hoosier, in his first season with Indiana, they went 20-12 and 9-11 in the Big Ten, and then in his second season, they were 12-15 and 7-12 in the Big Ten, and Archie Miller got fired, and then in his third season, they went 21-14 and 9-11 in the Big Ten, and so far this season, Trayce Jackson-Davis' Indiana team's gone 19-9 and 10-7 in the Big Ten. So Trayce Jackson-Davis in an Indiana uniform is 72-50 and 35-41 in the Big Ten Conference. That's a horrible record, and he doesn't have any tournament wins outside of the first 4-game win over Wyoming. And a lot of the great Hoosiers in the past have led Indiana to Final Fours and national championships, and that's why a lot of Indiana fans have players like that over Trayce Jackson-Davis, because of the fact he doesn't have the tournament wins and the championships and the banners like players in Kent Benson and Isaiah Thomas, and even Mike Woodson when he played for Indiana, and Steve Alford and players like that have a lot of wins under their resume. And it's just unfortunate for Trayce Jackson-Davis, because even though he does not have the wins under his belt, even though he could potentially go far in the NCAA tournament this season, I think that Trayce Jackson-Davis' legacy should be up there with the rest of the greats at Indiana University, because even if he doesn't win a lot this year, when Trayce Jackson-Davis leaves the Indiana program, he's going to leave it better than he found it. And that's the biggest key for me with his legacy, because Indiana University is a proud program in basketball, and they've been a down basketball program for 20 years, even though they had a few good seasons under Tom Crean and the one season under Kelvin Sampson, and they have not been the same program that they were under Bob Knight. And Trayce Jackson-Davis came to Indiana because he wanted to make Indiana a better program, and a lot of people question why he never shot the basketball. If Trayce Jackson-Davis had a shot threes, he would have gone to the NBA draft after one season, and he would have been another Romeo Langford, and he would not have really impacted Indiana University basketball, because he might have had a pretty good season in his freshman year, but then he would have left, and Indiana still would have been a really bad team. So Indiana is a much better program now than they were before Trayce Jackson-Davis got to Indiana, and he gave Indiana 4 great years on mediocre basketball teams that were full of players that weren't very elite. And Archie Miller, the first 2 seasons that Trayce Jackson-Davis played for Indiana, they were really bad, and that's why Indiana fired Archie Miller. And now with Mike Woodson, Indiana is winning more. They made the tournament last year and won a game, and Trayce Jackson-Davis is a big reason why, and he's done a fantastic job for the Indiana basketball program. And if Indiana is going to be really good in the future, 10-20 years from now, and they're able to have success with Mike Woodson with future players, and they can get more great recruits in, and even after Mike Woodson's gone and they're still able to recruit at a high level, then Trayce Jackson-Davis is the reason why, because he got Indiana back on the map. He did great things for the program, even though he wasn't able to potentially win the big games unless he does it this March Madness. So even though Trayce Jackson-Davis is declaring for the draft this season, and he's not coming back next season to potentially be the all-time leading scorer, Trayce Jackson-Davis is ready for the NBA. He needs to go now because he's 23 years old, and he needs to go while NBA draft scouts are still interested in him. And I think he could have a really great NBA career like Al Horford has if Trayce Jackson-Davis can learn how to shoot threes like Al Horford did. But when Trayce Jackson-Davis does leave the Indiana program, he made Indiana a much better program when he leaves it than when he found it, by improving year over year, going from 13 points per game to 20 points per game, and making Indiana a much better program that could potentially still be really great in the future. And I think that Trayce Jackson-Davis' legacy cannot be understated on how much he's done for the Indiana program. And now that Trayce Jackson-Davis is declaring for the draft, and deservedly so, Indiana fans should be thankful for what Trayce Jackson-Davis has given to the Indiana program and all that he's done for their basketball team. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below what you think about Trayce Jackson-Davis declaring for the draft, if you think he's ready for the NBA, and what you think that his legacy should be at Indiana. And I will see you next time.